All right, welcome into my kitchen. Today we are going to work on calzone. So I'm going to show you, so the purpose of this lab is for us to experience what it's like to use yeast as a leavener. So yeast is a biological leavener. In our quick breads we were using chemical leaveners with baking soda and baking powder. This is yeast, and so there are different types of yeast. For this particular recipe, we are going to be using an active dry yeast. An active dry yeast needs time to proof. So, as opposed to an instant yeast that doesn't, and it's kind of like it sounds, it can be used more instantly. So that kind of yeast can go directly into the flour and does not need time to proof. So what I have here is 1 1/4 cup of water, and it does need to be at about 120 degrees. Most hot water tanks are set at that temperature, so if you let your hot water run, that'll probably get you pretty close. It would be a temperature of a nice warm bath, okay? So if you don't have a thermometer, I have one right here, then you can just go by feel. You want it to be like you would like a really nice hot bath. So here I'm at 114, and we want to be in a range between 110 and 118 degrees. So we want to have our water there, and now we want to start proofing our active dry yeast. So this is 1 package of active dry yeast, which is also 2 1/4 teaspoons of yeast. So if you have a big bulk container, you'll have to measure it. If you're buying the packets, you want to use 1 whole packet. And then you want 1 teaspoon of sugar, which I have here. So we're going to put that in to the water along with the yeast. All right, and we are going to go ahead and let that sit for about 10 minutes until we get all kinds of foam happening at the top here, and that's an indication that it is starting to wake up. So right now in the package, it was in its dormant phase, sleeping, so to speak. But when we put it in the ideal conditions of that warm water, and then the sugar is the food, then it's going to begin to wake up and start to foam and create that carbon dioxide gas. So we'll let that sit. Okay, so I'll just tell you what I got going on here. So I realize most of you do not have a KitchenAid mixer, so I'm going to do most of this by hand, as I would think most of you will be. I will talk about both methods in case you have a KitchenAid. It's much nicer if you have a KitchenAid because it's a lot less work, but it can be still done without one. So if you have your KitchenAid, you want to use both of these attachments. This one's called the paddle attachment, and this one is called the hook. You'll need both of them. You will start off with the paddle attachment, so you can go ahead and put that on to your machine. All right, then for our ingredients, I have 4 cups of bread flour that I scooped and leveled. So I have that pre-measured, ready to go. And I have a teaspoon of salt and 1/8 of a teaspoon of black pepper. Salt is really important in yeast breads because it's the regulator for yeast. If you forget the salt, the yeast just keeps growing in the dough and it actually overgrows. So it's really important not to change the amount of salt in a recipe and not to skip it or miss it. And then I have 2 tablespoons of olive oil. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we are going to take 1 cup of flour, and when you've already measured it here, you don't need to be super accurate with your measurement as we're moving forward. So we're roughly going to take about 1 cup of flour and put it in there, and you can see my yeast. I don't know if you can see that, but it is starting to bubble and grow, so this is a really good sign. If your yeast has been sitting there for about 5 minutes and nothing's happening, couple of things that you could troubleshoot. You might not have gotten the water warm enough, or it is a possibility to kill the yeast with too hot of water. So you want to kind of troubleshoot that and make some assessments as to what you think you might have done wrong. So it should start bubbling pretty quickly after you put the water and the yeast and sugar all together, and it should begin to bubble. So we're doing really good here. Okay, so all right, so about 10 minutes have passed and my yeast is fully proofed, and I'm going to pour it into the bowl. You want to scrape out any little last bits. Okay, and now we are going to stir this until it looks really nice and smooth, like a smooth cake batter. And if you're using your KitchenAid, you're going to use that paddle attachment and just let it stir until it's nice and smooth. I'm getting all the lumps out. And I'm just using a mixing spoon. Okay, so that looks good, nice and smooth. Now I'm going to add the salt, pepper, and olive oil all at once. And then I'll stir those in. And so olive oil, or any fat for that matter, tenderizes the dough. It restricts a little bit of the gluten development and makes the dough a little softer. Okay, now I'm going to add in another cup of flour. And so if you remember, if you do not have bread flour at home, you can use just regular all-purpose flour. It will work. The dough will have less gluten development because, as you know, bread flour does have more gluten in it. But you are able to use all-purpose if that's all you have. Okay. So I'm going to just stir until all of that flour is fully absorbed. Okay, so you can see there. Now I'm going to add another cup of flour. So now we're at 3. And so I'm just going to stir until I feel like I cannot get any more of that flour absorbed into the dough. Then I'm going to turn it out onto the counter and hand knead it. So if you're using your KitchenAid, you would have switched to the hook at that second cup of flour. You'd switch to this hook. If you spray the hook with a little bit of kitchen oil spray, it'll help the dough from crawling out of the bowl. So that's a good tip. But you will continue adding more flour to your KitchenAid until that dough doesn't stick to the bottom of the bowl. And so you can see here, this is pretty much all I can really work in with a spoon right about here. So at this point, I'm gonna go and knead this by hand to add in that rest of the flour. So I have washed my counter down nicely. So I'll put a little bit of flour down. And then put my dough ball, scrape any remaining flour that is in the bowl out onto my counter. All right. Okay, so I'm going to show you how to knead by hand. It's all about the palms, okay? So you want to take your dough and then press with the palms and then turn the dough. So press and turn. Press and turn. And we're just going to keep doing this and adding more flour to the counter as the flour gets absorbed into the dough ball. I might not use all of that flour. In fact, when you're hand kneading, it's a little bit harder to get all of the flour in because we're just not as strong as the KitchenAid would be or is. But I can feel that this is still pretty sticky on my hands. It's sticking to my hands. So I'm gonna get a little bit more flour. So as you recall, I had about a cup of flour left in my bowl that needed to be incorporated into this dough ball. And also, once this dough ball is finished, it's going to need to rise. So I put it's my house a little bit cool this morning. I put my oven lights on and I will put the dough in there once I have incorporated all the flour and I can't get any more flour into the dough. You're gonna do this for about 15 minutes. So I have been kneading for about 15 minutes and I'm gonna show you how you can tell when your dough is ready. And it's called window painting. You wanna take a little bit of dough and you wanna try to see if you can stretch it thin enough without it ripping so that you can see light through it. And it's called window painting because if you put it to I have a window right over here. If you put it to the light of a window, you should be able to see the light through it without it breaking. And I know you can't tell from there, but there's no holes in it and I can see light through the dough. So that means it has been kneaded enough. So you wanna try that test a few times as you're kneading to determine when you could stop. So I'm just gonna work that little chunk back in there. And then where I've got all my folds here, I'm gonna turn that onto the bottom and then I'm gonna do something that's called rounding out the dough. I'm gonna take the dough between my hands and I'm gonna just give it a few twists. And this just helps to create a smooth membrane on top and a nice ball. Then this is just some olive oil. I'm gonna put a little bit of oil in my hands here. And I'm going to coat the dough with the oil. This is gonna prevent it from drying out and also from sticking to the bowl. Then I'm going to just put it in my original bowl. It's still dirty, it doesn't have to be clean. Place it in there, and then I'm taking a clean tea towel and I'm going to cover it and then put it into that oven that I've had the oven lights on and let it proof until it's doubled in size. So you can see the original size there. And this is gonna take about an hour. It might be shorter, it might be longer. It all depends how warm it is. The warmer that it is, the faster it's going to proof or double in size. All right, so our dough has more than doubled in size. So at this point, we're going to just press down the dough. That's called punching the dough, and that just releases any air. I'm going to remove this from the bowl and put it on my counter. Now, I want to divide this ball into fourths. This will make 4 calzone. So I'm just using my bench scraper, or you could use a knife. Cut this in half. And I also have a cookie sheet that's ready to go. I've lined it. You could use parchment paper on your cookie sheet, doesn't matter. Also, if you're baking these right away, you want to have your oven set to 425. All right, so we're just going to make balls of these remaining 4 because we're going to roll it into a round. So we want to start with a round. All right. So now I'm going to take my rolling pin and I'm going to roll this into a round disc. And so I want it actually fairly thin because once this bakes, it's going to double in size too. So you don't want your crust too thick. And I'm trying to keep it into a round. All right, so you want to have your pizza sauce ready to go. And so if you're making your own, it's a 1/2 cup of tomato puree. Puree is a little thicker than a sauce. Then I have a little bit of salt and pepper, 1/2 teaspoon of garlic powder, and a 1/2 teaspoon of Italian seasoning, and then 1 teaspoon of sugar. So we're gonna go ahead and begin filling, and you wanna think about what kind of toppings you want. So I'm going to spread just on half and keeping the sauce away about 1 inch from the edge, otherwise it won't seal up. Okay, and then I'm going to put in I've got some salami and olives and of course cheese. You can just make it plain if you want. I've got some sliced black olives. So again, keeping the ingredients away from the edge. Now my cheese. So this is just an Italian blend of cheeses. You could use any kind of cheese you want. All right, so now we are ready to fold this over. So you want to bring the edge over, and then you are going to use your fingers to do a braided seal here. So you put your finger down and you wrap and pinch the dough. So I'm just taking the dough over my finger and pinching it down. And we really want to make sure it's pinched well. Then we're going to take a little bit of olive oil and brush this on. And then we finally need to add a few vent holes, otherwise it's going to explode through your edge there. So I'm just going to take a sharp knife and make 3 vents. 1, 2, 3. And then move that and put it on my baking sheet. Okay, I just wanted to give a better close-up of what I meant about folding over. So I'm taking my finger and I'm pressing the dough over my finger like that. So it kind of gives it a little bit of a braided look. Okay, and then the olive oil. And if you don't have a brush, you can just use your hands. And then our 3 knife cuts. Okay. Okay, the calzone have come out of the oven and there they are. They're pretty large. I let them rise out on the counter probably for 30 minutes or more just because I wanted them ready for lunch. So they're probably a little bit bigger than they would have had I not done that. But anyways, there they are. Happy calzone making.